So our last two arguments we discussed were the Kalam cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument, which took current scientific evidence and showed how that evidence can logically take us to the conclusion that God exists. Once again, before we continue, do you guys have any questions about either the fine-tuning or the Kalam cosmological or anything that's come up in the past thus far? It's okay if you don't. It's fine. Okay. Perfect. We'll just move on. Today we're going to jump into the philosophical topic of ethics by discussing the morality argument. Now, this argument is not, and a lot of people get this confused, especially critics of this argument. It's not that God is required for someone to act morally. All right? The argument is putting the existence of morality into question. So it's an ontological instead of a epistemology. So like, we're not asking whether or not someone is capable of being good. We're questioning whether good and evil actually exist. Okay, that's the question. So, the question is, can objective good or evil, right or wrong, exist without God? Can objective good or evil,
okay,
right or wrong, exist without God? That's what we're questioning here with this argument. So this is a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre. He was a leader in the ideas of Marxism, and he was a proponent to certain disciplines such as critical theory, which is very popular nowadays. Basic critical theory being like your worth is expressed by how much of a victim you are.
Yeah.
So the more of a victim you are, the more important of the things you have to say are. Basically, that's a very simplistic version of critical theory. So he was a starter of that. So needless to say, he's not like one of my personal heroes. But however, he states here that the existentialist, which he was a philosopher about, an existentialist is someone who believes that what defines a person is not what society or others label that person, but it's that person's individual actions. It is a person's free will decisions that define who they are. That's the most simplistic way if I can express what an existentialist is. So I'll read that one more time. An existentialist is someone who believes that what defines a person is not what society says or what other labels that are put onto that person, but that person's own individual actions is what defines that person. It is a person's free will decisions that define who they are. So the existentialist is strongly opposed to a certain type of secular moralism, which seeks to suppress God at the least possible expense. In other words, nothing will be changed if God does not exist. That's the secular moralism that they're putting out there. That nothing will change if God does not exist as far as morality is concerned. He's saying that his beliefs oppose that. We shall rediscover the same norms of honesty, progress in humanity, and we shall have disposed of God as an out-of-date hypothesis which will die away quietly of itself. Okay? So his beliefs, even his beliefs, are opposed to this idea. The existentialist, on the contrary, finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist. So he is admitting that he himself believes that God does not exist, but he's saying that it's embarrassing for him to admit that God does not exist based upon his beliefs. For there disappears with him, with God, all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. There can no longer be any good a priori. We talked about that term, a priori. It's like what you can know apart from empirical evidence, by what you can see right in front of you, what you can observe. It's the opposite of that. It's like logic, like mathematics, science, the stuff behind science, like what makes science science. So it's like stuff, everything that you can know outside of empirical evidence, that's a priori. Okay? So there can no longer be any good a priori, meaning knowledge out of empirical evidence. So he's basically saying that you can no longer know this, that knowledge goes away, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it. Meaning there's no God to think it. It is nowhere written that the good exists, that one must be honest or one must not lie, since we are now upon the plane where there are only men. Dostoevsky once wrote, if God did not exist, everything would be permitted. And that, for existentialism, is the starting point. Everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist. Okay? So even he is admitting that outside of God, this idea of good no longer exists.
Now, was this the statement that he made near the end of his life? Because he had been an atheist for a long time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I don't know if it's him making the statement, he admits that he does not believe that God exists. He admits that. But he's saying that his beliefs and morality is embarrassed by that fact, because he admits that because God does not exist, this concept of good, the knowledge of good that we have, doesn't really exist. That in fact everything is permitted.
There's a conflict with this fact and what he believes. And he's sounds like he's acknowledging.
Well, he believes in this idea of being moral.
Mm-hmm.
He believes in this idea of being moral, but there's no basis for it. That's what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have Paul. This is from Romans 2:14 through 15. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves. Even though they do not have the law, they show that the law requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. Here Paul is stating that even though there are those who may not have been showed or taught the law of God is still written upon their hearts. It is God who shows us the standard of good and evil, right and wrong. So even though you may not even believe in God, God still writes these laws on your heart. All right. So here's a little bit. This is a reasonable faith video on this argument.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because he is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
All right. So here's the argument. Premise one, and like I've said before, this is a deductive argument. So, of course, you may run into somebody that's going to disagree with the conclusion that God exists. So, for them to disagree with the conclusion, they have to disagree with one of the premises. That they would need to be able to show that it is more false, that these premises are more false than true. Okay? So, premise one, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise two, objective moral values and duties do exist. And the conclusion, therefore, God exists. All right, so let's start with explaining all this, getting through it, and being able to defend it. All right, so let's first discuss the difference between moral values and moral duties, and then we'll get into the difference between objective versus subjective. All right, so values versus duties. Values have to do whether something is good or bad, and duties have to do with whether something is right or wrong. Does that make sense? Moral values have to do with whether something is good or bad. Duties, like a duty to do something, have to do whether that action is right or wrong. Does that make sense? So, just to further explain, duty has to do with moral obligation, what you ought or ought not to do. You are morally obligated to do something just because it would be. So you are not morally obligated to do something just because it would be a good thing for you to do. For example, it is morally good for you to become a doctor. That's a good thing for you to do. That doesn't mean you're morally obligated to it. That doesn't mean it's the right thing for you to do. You understand? That's so good and bad have to do with something's worth. It is good for somebody to choose to be a doctor. Right and wrong has to do with something being obligatory. Like you are so we're not saying that it is the right thing for you to become a doctor. You are obligated to become a doctor because it is good. That may not be the right thing for you. Just because it's good. So what we're saying is that moral values, both moral values, meaning that good and bad exist, and duties, moral duties exist, meaning there's a right and wrong decision for you. Okay? So, now we'll talk about objective versus subjective. An objective truth is true regardless of human opinion. It would mean that that action is good independently of any person's beliefs about that action. Doesn't matter what anybody believes, that there is a truth about it. So one person may think, well, this is right. Another person may think, no, it's wrong. We're saying that there is a truth beyond that. That no matter what that person says, that action is either good or evil, regardless of what the person says. There's an objective truth. A subjective belief, it is the belief of the individual person or society. In the video, it gives the example of ice cream. Somebody can say the best flavored ice cream is strawberry. That is their own opinion. There's no objective truth to a flavor of ice cream. Okay, just because somebody thinks that the best flavor of ice cream is strawberry, that does not make the best flavor is strawberry. It could be your own personal opinion. So what we're saying is that there are objective moral values and duties, regardless of human opinion. So here's an example. In our society, we believe that it is wrong to kill someone because they state that they are a homosexual. Our society believes that's wrong. However, in other societies, they feel justified in administering a death sentence on anyone who claims to be a homosexual. Which society has the correct belief? Is there a correct belief? Is one society more morally good or bad when it comes to their beliefs? Why? What gives one society the right to judge another society? They're just doing what their society says is the right thing to do. Who's to say that one society is right and wrong? What we are saying is there is a right decision, that there is a correct decision. Okay? Regardless of what another society or our society says, there is a correct or a certain truth beyond what our society or individual personal belief says. And that's what we're saying. Is that clear?
It is clear to me, and the issue is that a nation who believes that it's a good thing to kill someone who is homosexual they won't get that.
Well, they will say that they are fully justified in doing that.
Mm-hmm.
That they're saying that they have the right to do that, and we're saying no, that's bad. That's bad. Why? What gives us the right to do that? Right? What gives us the right to say no? That's wrong. Why is that wrong?
So we believe that it's an objective truth, and Iran believes it's a subjective belief.
They believe that they're right, and we're wrong. We're saying that no, we're right, and you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What we're saying is somebody's right,
Mm-hmm.
and somebody's wrong. This isn't just a subjective debate. We can't just say, well, that's good for you guys. If that's what you want to believe, that's fine. If you want to believe that kind of action is okay, that, if a certain society, I'm not going to get into that, but it's to say a certain society says that they can have that 30-year-old males can have sex with 10-year-old girls, okay, and they say that that's perfectly fine. That's, you guys do whatever you guys want, and we'll just do whatever we want. There is no real truth. But we're saying, yes, there is a real truth. We're saying that there is a right and wrong answer there, that there is a more correct answer there. That's what we're saying. Okay? So, what is the basis of objective moral values on naturalism? Well, according to naturalism, we receive our sense of morality through biological evolution and social conditioning. But what if we were evolved differently? We could have a completely different moral code. And we can observe that different societies have developed different moral codes. That's obvious to us. We can plainly see that. An action isn't necessarily morally good or bad. It is just values that have developed over time to benefit that society. So who is to say that you have a better sense of morality when it comes to naturalism? Also, if we are just evolved animals, why is there a moral standard? Charles Darwin stated that if men reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their daughters, and no one would think of interfering. So it doesn't seem to be a basis of objective moral values under naturalism. When I say naturalism, I'm saying that God does not exist. Okay, obviously. Okay. So if God does not exist, there doesn't seem to be a basis of this objective moral values under that. So what about duties? What's the basis of objective moral duties on naturalism? To whom do we owe a duty not to do wrong? When a lion kills a zebra, should the lion be tried for murder? Is the lion's action morally wrong? There would be no moral obligation to do anything. Nothing to show that murder, rape, or incest is really wrong. To say something is biologically or sociologically advantageous does not mean that the actions are really right or wrong. At most, you're going against the herd and acting unfashionably. That's the best you can do. So, that's how this is the defense for premise number one. If God does not exist, it does seem, according to naturalism, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Okay? Now, here are some objections to premise number one. So these are all three. We'll start with the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, okay.
I've never heard that word before.
Well, if you listen to debates between Christians and atheists, you will hear this all the time, and then you'll hear some Christian in the audience yell out, "Euthyphro," just because this dilemma is brought up all the time in debates. So they bring up the Euthyphro dilemma. So in the Euthyphro dilemma, there are only two options available to how God would relate to morality. Is something good because God commands it, So anything can be good if God commanded. So anything can be good if God commanded it. So what that means is murder and rape could be good things if they were commanded by God. Well, that doesn't seem to be a very good option. It's like, if God commanded us to murder and rape, does that make that good? Well, that doesn't seem to make sense. All right, so here's the second option available to us. Is God good because his actions conform to a standard of good that exists independently of God? Meaning that justice is, there is such a thing as justice and love, but they're apart from God. They exist apart from God. Okay? And that's the other option. What this is suggesting is something called moral Platonism. Now we'll get into this later, but moral Platonism suggests that there are abstract objects that actually exist, that are called love and justice and mercy. And that also means that there are abstract objects that are called hate, injustice, cruelty. So we'll talk about this later. But it doesn't seem to make sense that doesn't seem to be a good option either, that like something out there that's called justice that actually exists. So what's our option here? We only have two options, and this is the dilemma. Well, the answer is this is a false dichotomy. There is a third option available to us. And so good is not something outside of... All right. So good is not something outside of God, nor is it something he arbitrarily commands. It is his very nature. God wills something to be good because he himself is good. Now, like I said, you'll hear this brought up all the time concerning this argument. Even on a professional level debate between professional philosophers, this is brought up all the time. So it highlights that atheist philosophers are ignorant when it comes to Christian philosophical work. They just don't keep up on it. This problem has been solved a long time ago. Just let me know when you're good.
Oh, go ahead, I can.
No, you're fine. Just let me know. So, our next objection is atheistic moral Platonism, like what I just talked about. As I stated previously, there are abstract objects that actually exist that are called love, justice, and mercy. That means there are also abstract objects that are called hate, injustice, cruelty. And when I say abstract objects that exist, I don't know if y'all remember, but when we talked about what can exist outside of nature, we talked about these abstract objects, and the example I used was numbers. This idea that does numbers actually exist? Like, does the number 7 actually exist? That's what I mean, like abstract objects. So, this proposed suggestion wants to deny premise 1, but it wants to affirm premise 2. So this objection wants to affirm that objective moral values and duties do actually exist, but they exist because these abstract objects exist. Okay? So, justice and mercy actually exists because there is this abstract object out there called justice. And for us to follow justice is to follow this abstract object. However, it seems absurd. It just to believe that there's something out there called justice that exists in the absence of persons. I mean, what does it mean? What does that mean that the abstract object of justice is just? The nature of moral duty or obligation seems incompatible with a theistic moral Platonism. Why would I be obligated to align myself with mercy instead of cruelty? Why would I need to align myself with justice instead of injustice? And if moral Platonism is combined with naturalism, it is fantastically improbable that an animal would emerge from blind evolutionary processes and comprehend that these abstract entities like justice, that these animals would correspond to the abstractly existing realm of moral values. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make common sense. That what I'm saying is it just so happened through our evolutionary process that our moral sense just happened to align with these abstract objects. It just happened that way. It just seems fantastical, basically. So our third objection is to premise one is this reality of secular humanism. So once again, this wants to deny premise one, but it accepts premise two. It wants to say that objective moral values and duties exist. Well, it's not surprising that people want to accept premise number two. Almost everybody wants to accept premise number two. We want to believe that racism, rape, murder, we want to believe that all these things are wrong regardless of what anybody has to say about it. Almost everybody wants to accept premise number two, but they want to deny premise number one. We don't want to agree with that. So what does this one say? Well, this view suggests that whatever contributes to human flourishing is good, and whatever hinders flourishing is bad. And there's no need to dig any deeper. Morality is just that simple. This view, however, seems arbitrary. What if someone has a different belief in what contributes to human flourishing? What if that contradicts? What if one person believes, what if I believe what would contribute to human flourishing is to only allow successful, healthy, and intelligent people to reproduce? And anyone who does not meet this criteria would no longer have that right. Someone could argue that it is morally wrong to prevent someone's right to have children. That's wrong for you to do. Why? Why is that wrong? So it seems arbitrary whenever these concepts come up. In this case, the humanist would state that you would have to use logic and reason to discover what is actually the more moral act. But this goes against the view. We should just know what is more moral. And this is once again, the taxicab fallacy. Is, well, I will agree with you so far, but once we get to these complications, well, it's the exception. We'll get out. Well, a good a good model of moralism can't work that way. It has to work on every possible point. Also, why is human flourishing more important than the flourishing of mice? If humans are just evolved animals, why do we get to be the important ones?
Because we are. Let's just stop right there. Sorry.
Moral values supervene or attached to certain natural state of affairs. For example, if you sacrifice yourself to allow a friend to live, is considered a moral act. In fact, it is considered one of the most moral things you can do. But why? The act seems to go against what would be the natural way of thinking, which would be self-preservation. Why do we think that this is a moral act for you to do? So it just seems that it's just too simple. You have to dig deeper. There are more complicated issues to bring up. So it's just not satisfactory. All right. So that's basically the three objections we have to premise number one. Any questions before we go on to number two? No? Okay. So, number two. Do we apprehend moral values and duties? Just to say that our moral understanding comes from socio-biological origins does not make them objective. To state something is true or false because you are able to point to its origin commits what's called the genetic fallacy. Let me say that again. So it's another, when I say these fallacies, they go against the rules of logic, okay? So it goes against the rules of logic to state that something is true or false because you are able to point to its origin, that you are able to point to its origins. So, like, somebody could say, well, you believe in God because based upon our biological evolution, you believe in God because of you wanted, at some point, humans wanted an explanation for these natural events, and they just pointed to these divine beings that caused these natural events that they couldn't explain. Well, just because you're able to point to an origin does not mean that that person is necessarily right or wrong. That doesn't mean that that makes it automatically false just because you're able to point to its origin. Like, all right, so like another example. Let's say, I'm thinking, this is kind of off the cuff. Let's say I believe that let's say that I believe that stars are made of gas, or big exploding balls of gas, because I had a dream one night where this demon put together a play about how stars are made of gas. Okay, so just because, well, it just so happens that I'm right. Okay, it just so happens that knowledge is true. But just because you can point to the dream, well, you just believe this because you had some crazy dream about some demon having a play about this. Well, that's true, but that doesn't make it false. It's actually true. So that's what's called the genetic fallacy. Okay? So just because you can point to something's origin, in this case, does not make it objective. Does that make sense? Just because our moral understanding, like, can we trust our moral understanding? Well, they're saying you have this moral understanding because of sociobiological origins. That you evolved into this belief. Well, just because I have these, just because you can point to why I have these beliefs, does not make it objective. Okay? It's just we evolved into that fact.
So an objective, I see it as true regardless, it says, of human opinion, so it's kind of an absolute.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So here, okay, so let me put it this way. Here, this person wants to say that in this kind of objection, this person wants to say that there are objective moral values and duties. But they're saying that you have these kind of objective moral values and duties because you evolved through time to have these feelings, to have these beliefs. Well, just because you can point to the origins of why I have it, or your belief of why I have it, does not make those beliefs objective. Does that make sense? So, in fact, we can't trust them. It seems we wouldn't be able to trust our moral understanding because it would not have been developed by seeking truth. Instead, it would have been aided by survival. And if naturalism is true, and our beliefs are the result of naturalistic evolution, all of our beliefs are suspect. Meaning we should be skeptical about our moral sense. But would this be healthy? Is it healthy for us to deny premise number 2 by denying our sense of morality, as naturalism suggests? Denying our sense of morality would be similar to denying our other senses. Should I not acknowledge my sense of touch when I am touching a hot pan, or my sense of hearing when I hear someone yelling for help? Of course I should. It would be a danger to myself and others around me if I would not acknowledge them to be true. In the same way, it would be a danger to myself and others if I would not acknowledge my sense of morality. Almost anyone that you would come in contact on the street would not deny premise number 2. For it just seems common sense to us that certain acts are right while others are wrong, regardless of human opinion. It just seems common sense. Almost everyone wants to say that premise number 2 is correct. Therefore, it seems more true than false that objective moral values and duties do indeed exist. So, that gets to our conclusion. So this is the argument. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. And I've shown it seems more right than wrong that this is the case. In fact, naturalism shows us that, if you take away God, that also takes away these objective moral values and duties. And we get to number 2, and it just seems everyone wants to believe in number 2. No one wants to deny that it's just somebody's opinion that rape is wrong. Everyone wants to believe that it is wrong regardless of what somebody may argue for. So, therefore God exists. This argument is probably going to influence more people than any of the arguments I'm going to discuss. Because premise number 2 is something that almost everyone wants to believe.
We wouldn't survive without.
Right. So, if you can support premise number 1, and almost everyone's going to want to believe in premise number 2, it's going to be a very influential argument. Any questions?
Just out of curiosity, is there one particular person or a group of people who came up with this statement? Or is this like part of the
You mean the
process?
argument?
Yeah, this particular one.
Actually, Dr. Craig came up with this argument by accident. He was teaching he was giving a lecture in a college, and through interaction with the students, he determined that almost everyone wants to believe in number 2. Well, as a philosopher, he's like, well, you can't believe number 2 and also deny that God exists, because there is no basis for you to believe in number 2. There's no foundation. That foundation does not exist. Now, you can come up with a moral code. You can come up with some sort of moral model to say how you can be good and how that benefits society. You should be good because it benefits society. You would be, coming up with some sort of moral model in that way is not really that hard. But just because society tells you that it benefits society and that's what makes it good, does that make it objective? It doesn't. It's just that society telling you what's good for its society. And what we can observe is different societies say different things when it comes to morality, to moral values and duties. And if there is an objective sense of, or if there is an objective truth of moral values and duties, there has to be a basis beyond society's beliefs. It has to go beyond human beliefs. And the only thing that goes beyond human beliefs are either these abstract objects or God. Now, some will try to say that these abstract objects exist, that there's something out there called justice, there's something out there called love, but there's also something out there that's called greed, there's something out there that's called cruelty. And what is it that forces us to have to align ourselves with the good abstract objects instead of the bad abstract objects? What forces us to make that? Well, it's society tells us. Well, then you're in this circle. You're in this circular argument. The only basis you can have, really, the only strong foundation that you can have is if you believe that God exists. I believe this is good because God, who is the supreme good, most maximally moral being out there, tells us it's good. because he is good. He's like, be like me, because this is good. And that's the strongest foundation you can have for objective moral values and duties.